Welcome to Season 2 of the Color Success Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Iris Chen is a writer, unschooler, and founder of the Untigering movement. After starting out as a hardcore tiger mother, she began to deconstruct when she saw all the negative effects of authoritarian parenting. Now, she is on a mission to empower others to untiger by promoting mental health, peaceful parenting, and anti-oppression in parenting and education. She recently moved back to California with her husband and 2 sons after 16 years of living in China. Well, Iris, thank you so much for joining the show. I'm really glad that you reached out, and I'm really excited to talk about your new book coming out. I'm a parent myself, so I have 2 daughters, and I always love to talk about parenting because it is the most challenging job I've ever had, but also the greatest joy, of course. So can you tell us a little bit about the untigering movement in a few words, or rather, I guess, starting off with the tigering parenting?
Sure. So when I think of tiger parenting, I think of very authoritarian parenting that relies heavily on power and control. It's very strict, has a lot of rules and very high demands and expectations. And oftentimes, this type of parenting is associated with Asian parenting, probably because of Amy Chua's book, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, where this term first started. So for me, untigering is the process of, it's like my own personal journey of moving away from that type of authoritarian parenting to embrace more peaceful, conscious, respectful parenting. And in particular for me, whereas like academic achievement is like a very high priority for in tiger parenting, for me, I have chosen to unschool my kids. And unschooling for me means like natural life learning that is consent-based and self-directed.
I like in the sample chapter that you sent me, you were talking about playing the piano and kind of the nuances of that. Can you talk about that example? Because I think it nicely highlights what you're explaining right now.
Sure. So yes, as any good Asian kid knows, you need to learn a musical instrument, right? So when my kids were younger, they showed interest in learning piano. You know, they started when they were 4, and I found them a great teacher. But of course, you know, it comes to the point when the practice becomes a burden and they fight it and they're not interested in it anymore. But I continue to push them. And I think because of my unschooling philosophy, where I believe it really needs to be consent-based and they need to have intrinsic motivation and be personally vested in the choices that they make for their lives. So I realized that when I was forcing this upon them, that didn't really align with my values and my beliefs about how I should be treating them. And so it came to a point where I gave them the option to decide, okay, do you want to continue playing piano? And surprisingly, they actually did. Like, they enjoyed that ability to be creative and to create music. But what they didn't like were certain aspects of it. For example, like my older child, he felt pressured to, because he was older, to move faster and to learn more songs. And the teacher was like, oh, well, since he's doing well, I'll give him more. But I think for him, he didn't enjoy that. He didn't want the pressure. So we pulled back and I just talked to the teacher and asked the teacher to maybe only give him 1 or 2 new songs each week. Whereas my younger son was really wanting more of a challenge and wanting to maybe learn more pop music. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, just giving him that freedom and communicating with the teacher, finding ways for them to enjoy what they were doing. So it wasn't the piano learning itself, it was how they were doing it and learning to find ways to do it in a way that aligned with who they were and with their own motivations and their own goals.
I mean, at the core of it, you're talking about communication and talking about feelings, right? Because again, the assumption was, oh God, I'm being that typical Asian parent. And making my kids play the piano and they're not going to like it, but they actually did like it. But the nuances or the differences and the interest were what was communicated. So tell me a little bit more on how you view, because again, I'm a psychologist, so how you view the impact of tiger parenting on mental health, especially with children.
Oh, yes. I think there are so many negative outcomes. I think because just seeing in my own life how I was, the child of typical immigrant parents who were Asian. So, their style was pretty much aligned with tiger parenting, maybe not as extreme as in her book. But I think there's just a lot of stress that parents perpetuate when they put a lot of pressure on their kids to perform. So we see that in a lot of mental health in young students nowadays in very competitive environments where they're so anxious, they're so stressed, it can lead to depression, helplessness, and even suicide.
Yeah.
And it's not always the parenting, it's just this culture of competitiveness, of like high achievement and stuff like that. So that is definitely one negative outcome where there's so much pressure and emphasis placed on these outward markers of achievement, and we're not caring for our children in holistic ways, caring for their mental health or their social skills and all that. I think for me, growing up in that environment, I also learned to disconnect, or not, I didn't learn, but I was taught to disconnect from my own sense of self because I was never given autonomy or power. Like I just did whatever I was told to do. These hoops that I needed to jump through, I jumped through. I followed the track that was laid out for me. And
What was
then
that? What track was that?
I think just to be a good student, to do what you were told, to be a good girl, all those things, like meeting the expectations of the adults in my life, and the people around me, like even the teachers giving positive affirmation. And then for me to understand that's how I would get acknowledgement and affirmation and my sense of self-worth. And so my sense of self-worth became tied to those things. And so there's also this fear of failure, this fear of trying new things, because you only, at least for me and my personality, I only wanted to stick to the things that I knew I could do well, because that's what I was, given the pat on the back for.
Right.
So we also, yeah, I realized then growing up and becoming an adult with some freedom, with some autonomy and the power to make my own decisions, that I didn't know how to. It was very difficult for me because I was not practiced in it. I didn't know how to be attuned to my own emotions or my own desires, my own passions. I was just doing whatever was expected of me. And so I feel like there's a lot of people who grew up in this type of parenting where they go through this like midlife crisis or whatever, because they realize that the place they are in life doesn't actually reflect who they are or what they want to do with their life, who they want to be. And
Or
I think
bring
a
a
lot,
core sense of happiness, really, right? Or content, because I think a lot of people are striving for those markers, making that quote unquote the milestones, right? Making that six-figure salary or seven-figure salary and having a house. And I would like to touch upon what career you went in first to meet those expectations and then kind of how you pivoted. But again, accountant, lawyer, doctor, and medical doctor specifically, because although I am a doctor, I think, again, the mental health one is like a variance. Like, what are you going to do with that? Says my optometrist. And I'm like,
right.
I'm doing okay, being a psychologist. But I mean, what path did it lead you on, and what impact do you feel it had on your mental health?
The interesting thing is, like, maybe my personality, and even at a young age, I knew, I mean, I was very high academic achieving, and I went into college thinking I could do whatever I wanted. But when it came down to it, I like hated my science classes. I didn't want to take any math courses. And so that sort of eliminated a lot of options for me. And I ended up choosing English as my major in school. And actually, my parents were very hands-off and supportive of that, because I think their own leanings are more like liberal arts and stuff like that. So they didn't give me a lot of pressure, but I saw all my friends around me. There were very few people in the liberal arts. They were all like
Sure.
pre-med or, going into business or all those things. And so you can see that there's this cultural pressure, these cultural norms and expectations of what you can do, what you're expected to do. But yeah, I think my family was a little bit different in that, where they gave me freedom to choose that. And I went into it actually like having no idea what I wanted to do with it, but I just loved it. I enjoyed analyzing literature and reading and all that.
That paid off, right? Like you didn't know, but you were setting yourself up for that. And I think one thing that I really encourage, a lot of people reach out to me and ask me about psychology or what path they should take. And English is a fantastic choice, because if you think about where our society is heading, those soft skills are going to differentiate folks, because a lot of things are being automated, unfortunately. And so the people that can communicate, even through this odd Zoom time and virtual platform, they're doing really well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't go into it thinking of a particular career. In fact,
Mhm.
it's just like I just enjoyed it. And when I graduated, I took a year and taught English in Asia and loved that, and went back and became an editor at a startup company. And so it wasn't a practical choice, but it was one that I did because I enjoyed and it fit who I was. And so I'm really glad that I had that opportunity.
So you're
And
a part of
also,
the Untigering movement before it was a movement.
I guess so. I guess so. And also thinking, in terms of our kids and like the opportunities that we want for our children, just knowing that our world is changing so much, like you said, even this 1 year of, pandemic life and all the new skills that we needed to learn in order to function and to thrive in this condition. And so just knowing that the silos or those that framework that we have in terms of what we think our children need in order to succeed, like that's changing every day. That's changing moment by moment. Our world is changing so fast. And so instead of like boxing our kids into that certain framework, um, to really be flexible and open, and to give them the skills to learn and to learn how to pivot and to learn how to gain information, gain new skills, instead of hyper focusing on the particulars of the skills,
Right.
because those are going to, be totally different in 10 years time.
Yeah, I mean, right before this, one of the homework that my daughter had to do was a Google exercise on how to use Gmail. And so I'm like, wow, times have changed. A third grader is needing to do a Gmail, a homework assignment, So I think you're absolutely right. And we even talk about, oh, my first and third grader, like, when I go, do we have to leave the house for college? I don't want to. And it's like, well, can I record that? And I was like, you know what, honey, things may change where college probably won't even be a thing. That's my prediction. I'm putting it out there in the universe. And that the one thing that's sad about it for me, though, is college was one of the best times of my life, because of the socialization and learning that autonomy, to wake up if you wanted to. And I say that because people can sleep in and not do their work and kind of coast by. But there's just this aspect of socialization there that I feel was so helpful to my development. And I would be sad if they didn't have that piece.
Hmm. Yeah. So I think, that's a lot of pushback that we often get as homeschoolers, the fear of the lack of socialization or the lack of life skills. But even as you talked about that, like I had a wonderful, awesome experience in college as well. But a lot of it was not academic. A lot of it
Yeah.
had very little to do with the actual schooling. And so how can we still provide those opportunities for our children in relevant and meaningful ways that don't necessarily need to be tied to academic pursuits if they don't want that. Right. So,
yeah. And kids, I don't want to discourage, the academic aspect per se. I like to balance that out because it was phenomenal to start my education and ultimate career. But I think what we're speaking to is really enjoying what you're studying and immersing yourself in. I also try to tell them, like, continue to learn skills no matter how old you are, because I'm starting to see the impact that limited technology knowledge has on a lot of the generation that didn't grow up with that, right? And they're feeling I've noticed like an increase in retirements, around me, because it's just kind of like, forget this. Like, I'm not going to, provide this service with virtual means, right? So, but one thing that I struggle with, right, is that balance, because how do you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, how do you balance, giving kids kind of the autonomy, so to speak, and then also teaching them that there are things in life that we have to do despite not liking them, right? I mean, I don't like to pay my bills, but I have to pay my bills, right? So how do you kind of foster that as well?
Yeah, I want to be really, careful and nuanced with this question, because I think sometimes parents ask this question or frame it in this way in order to justify a lot of
Sure.
control and coercion over children. Was just like is for their good, so I need to make them do this. But I think, like, I totally believe in accountability and grit, perseverance, and learning competence. But I think that really needs to be paired. I guess you said balance. I don't know if that's the word I would use, but it needs to be paired with autonomy and with
Sure.
consent, because with it as an adult, you pay the bills because you understand the consequences of not doing so, right? And so there is value, there is intrinsic motivation for you to do so. But if somebody just said, like, go and push this boulder up the hill because it's good for you, you're not necessarily going to do that, because you've never experienced the why behind that. And so I think it's the same for kids in some ways, where we give them a lot of, like, accountability and guidance, but it's done without their consent, without their autonomy. So we may consider, like, we may try to be controlling, the food or how they eat or doing their homework, or whatever it is. But I think in those situations, we need to really lean more into connection and communication and trust and respect of them instead of rules. So, yes, we can definitely teach them about doing hard things, but not in a power over way, not in a coercive or controlling way. So, for example, doing the dishes, that's not usually an enjoyable activity for many people, and yet it needs to be done. So I think something that I wrote about in my book is both respect and relationship. And because we are in a family, because we are sharing this space together, because we are a team and we love each other and we care about the other person's needs, then we are going to intrinsically want to do things to make each other feel comfortable. So it's not like I'm making you do the dishes, but we're inviting participation. We are doing it ourselves. And we have conversations about it so that we can negotiate how to have win-win solutions.
Right.
So, yeah.
So explaining context and explaining in a different way versus saying, hey, you need to do the dishes because this is your chore. It's more of, hey, we are working as a family, and yes, they're dirty. Some of us don't want to do it, but let's help each other out.
Yes, definitely. And there will be times when we may need to step in for, very extreme cases for their personal safety or whatever. But hopefully there's enough trust and, relationship, that foundation that is built where they can trust us to step in and help them make those decisions, because they know that our goal is not just to control them. Our goal, like, that's not our motivation. They know that we are doing it out of love, out of, absolutely desiring what's best for them. But there's that trust that they can lean on in those times.
What sort of language would you use, let's just say if a kid was throwing a tantrum. I mean, it happens. Like, no, I don't want to do my math homework. And it sounds like, you raise your kids to be very participatory, but what about the parents that are trying to learn this new skill of collaborating? And, kids sometimes have meltdowns, as do adults. So what kind of verbiage or language would you use in response to that?
I think it really depends on the parent and the child. I don't have a lot of scripts, but definitely one of validation and understanding. So making room, like holding space for all the emotions instead of trying to shut them down. Nowadays there's like a lot of talk about gaslighting and how we shut down emotions. We pretend that they aren't there. We want to make them go away. And we do the same to our kids all the time. And so how can we not gaslight them? How can we make room? Yes, like their feelings, their emotions around this thing are legitimate. And
Sure.
we don't need to try to change the way they feel. So I think one thing is definitely to show understanding, making room for their emotions. Like if they don't want to do their homework, we can absolutely say, I know it's really hard, you want to go out and play, or you're feeling overwhelmed. So when they know that we are empathizing with them, when we're on their side, then we can attune to them, and then they are more open to our input and to talking through the solutions. But oftentimes we just jump straight to the solution, right? We say like, well, it's not that big of a deal, just do it and then you can go and play. But actually in the long run, it is much more effective to let them feel their emotions, to be on their side, and then when they're more in a more calm state of mind, to help work through solutions together.
I think that's, a great way to frame it. And I guess I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about your transition, right? You moved the family and yourself to China for what, 16 years.
Mhm.
How was that and what led to that decision?
Yeah, so we actually went over without kids. So it was my husband and I. We were newly married, 2 years married, and we went out. We sort of wanted an adventure, and we went out to teach English at the university. And yeah, and so my kids were born there. They were raised there. They lived there their whole lives until just a year ago. So that was a very amazing experience, and I would highly recommend for every every family to consider living overseas or traveling abroad at some point, because I think it really opens up your perspective. And I think
Definitely.
it did give me the freedom to begin this untigering process, because I was away from my family. I was away from my cultural bubble in some ways. And there's this term called third culture. And as a Chinese American living in China, I lived in a third culture. And in some ways, that gave me a lot of freedom to shape my own culture, to shape my own family values that were apart from, these influences that I had grown up with. So I really got to pick and choose the things that were really that really resonated with me, that I really believed in. And so I'm really grateful for that experience, that I had that freedom and that space to do that.
So now that you're back, do you see American schooling and culture in a very different light, and how so?
Um, I think because I began unschooling in China, I definitely had the Chinese schooling model to contrast it with. But I grew up in American schools, and so I still saw, even with all the developments and all the sort of fun activities or whatever of American schools, still the coercive elements of it. It's still very adult centric and still very top down. And so I have a lot of critiques of American schooling, everywhere around the world. When I was in China, definitely so. And here too, it's used in very coercive ways, and can, just be a tool of oppression for children, really, and to perpetuate propaganda and certain ways of thinking. So I think we really need to challenge some of those things and to find ways to incorporate learning that is outside, the curriculum that is handed down to us, because especially as Asian Americans, our stories are not told.
Right.
We I think it's getting better, but very few of us grew up understanding a lot of our history through a non-white centric lens.
Right.
And so those are things that we need to be very aware of if our kids are in the school setting, and we need to be very intentional about bringing in other views so that we're not just, swallowing whole whatever is fed to us.
Right. And you mentioned the contrast in China from the unschooling, untigering perspective. What was it like in terms of, I don't want to bring my preconceived notions into it. So how did you perceive the Chinese schooling system?
Yes, I felt very sad about it because I saw my local friends who didn't have any choice but to put their kids in this situation pretty much. And it is so just so dehumanizing and so damaging for kids' psyches, I believe. There's a lot of comparison, like they would post people's grades up in front of everybody so that everybody knew how they ranked. You would get shamed publicly if you were not doing well. There's just so much pressure on getting good grades or doing well on the test. They ate lunch at their desk because they were not allowed to move around or go and play because the school was afraid of being liable for a child getting hurt. And because for many of
Wow.
these families, this was their one child and they're
Right.
very protective. And so if anything happened to this one child, the school would get in a lot of trouble. And so one way that they tried to mitigate that was just to not let children move at all.
Wow.
So there were just many, many things that were very, just very sad about it. Thankfully, my kids never went into the grade school public setting. We put them in a kindergarten, preschool setting that was Montessori. And so that was really great for that time, but we never put them into public school there.
So I don't know if you saw, but are there any mental health resources available to children and particularly teachers and adults that are implementing these strategies?
I can't say for sure because I was never fully in the system. There might be school counselors, but from what I am aware of, even in the society at large, there are very few resources for mental health. But I think that's changing. I did have a friend who, through his company, could call a number and get some mental health counseling. And so I think it is changing, but I'm not sure for children, and maybe only if the situation is very dire. But the majority of children over there are going through these very stressful situations.
Yeah.
And I don't think that there are enough resources to
I
help
think
them.
it sounds like one intervention is to let them play. I feel like that's, I mean, that would relieve a lot of stress, right? To not feel confined to a space.
Yes, there's that. But even after school, then they're all in their
Studying.
after school classes and studying.
Yeah.
I think the government was starting to try to implement different legislation to help deal with that. Like they had a shorter day on Tuesdays, and they had to limit the amount of homework that they gave to like first and third graders. So there were things that they were trying to do. Um, but I think as society as a whole, there's just no childhood
Yeah.
there. which was really sad. So even if my kids wanted to go out and play with people in the middle of the afternoon, there would be nobody to play with, sadly. So.
Hmm. So how did they get their socialization? You have multiple children, so that helps. But if no one is outside playing or they can't have play dates, how does that work?
So thankfully, I was part of a homeschool co-op. So there were other families. Many of them were foreign families because technically homeschooling is not allowed in China. But there were foreign and local families, and we gathered together at least once a week to spend time together, play, maybe do a little lesson. And so I'm really grateful for that community because my kids grew up with that community throughout their childhood, and they're still great friends with those kids to this day. So I'm very grateful for that. Yeah, so mostly that was their community and their friends.
So how was it moving back to America and their transition over here to not having maybe all those friends that they grew up with?
I think because I moved also during that time, and it was just a horrible time for me because I jumped straight into eighth grade of junior high, and middle school is always very angsty, right? So my kids were 9 and 11 when we moved back. But I think the transition was as smooth as it could have been. And I credit a lot of that to the fact that I'm unschooling, actually, because our family life, our lifestyle stayed pretty consistent because that family culture was still there. That family support was still there. We were still in relationship with one another. If I had thrown them into school
Sure.
after having, unschooled them in China, I think that would have been a very hard transition. But because our family life stayed very consistent, that eased the transition. And then COVID hit and we were all at home anyway. So,
Yeah. So
but
are
I
they in public school or are they still homeschooling?
no, we're still unschooling. Yes. Um, but then I think that also gave us time to just ease into things and to take the transition as it came. Like, even
Right.
for us as the adults, we didn't jump into anything immediately. We took 6 months because we'd been away for 16 years.
Yeah.
We knew it would take a good amount of time for us to just figure out life in America again. We left before there was Netflix and Facebook and before Obama, like that was a long time ago. And so
Yeah.
for us to come back, I mean, we came back every summer, so pretty much. And so it was easier for us. We felt very bicultural, but we knew it would still take some time to transition back. And so giving ourselves that time, giving our kids that time, there was no pressure to like accomplish anything or like hit any milestones or, even academically. And so I'm very grateful for that margin that we had to do that.
So, I mean, you've seen it work from your own experiences. So, tell me a little bit more about what led you to create the Untigering movement, so to speak, because you're publishing a book, you have a huge Facebook group. So, I know we don't want to set specific goals, but what is your vision in terms of creating this community?
Yeah, when I started out as writing a blog because I was going through this process of untigering, right? Like of transitioning from being a tiger parent and transitioning to peaceful parenting and unschooling. And I knew this was a very unique experience for me. And also, especially as an Asian American, that these really go against the tide of the cultural norms that I grew up with, And so I wanted a space to talk about that and to wrestle with how that, what does this mean for me as an Asian American to not practice these ways of parenting and to break those generational cycles and to embrace a new way of viewing my kids and living life together with them in a way that felt very radical. And so I think my vision I didn't know this was going to become a thing. I didn't set out to become an influencer or anything, but I was just telling my story. And it was just amazing how many people began resonating with that. And so I'm so grateful for that. And I think my vision now is really to create some cultural shifts and generational shifts where just to be not a model, but one story, one face and voice of representation of what is possible, and that we, even like as an Asian American, can define our own stories, define our own narratives. We don't have to be trapped by these traditions that no longer serve us, that we can do something different.
And when does the book come out?
Yes, it's coming out January 5th, 2021.
Ooh,
So
yeah,
less than a
something to
month.
look forward to in 2021.
Yes, hopefully it'll be the start of a new year, start of something different than what we've been experiencing. Yes, but I'm really excited to have that out and to share that with the world. And specifically because a lot of parenting resources out there are written by white people and written for the white family. And
Right.
that's all that we've ever had. And we read them and we had to learn how to incorporate it. But probably, in your work as well, talking with clients who are Asian or Asian American or non-white, it's just like, yes, these principles and these philosophies and whatever are good and helpful, but they need to be translated in a way that is contextual, and that makes sense for that person with that background. And I feel like that was really missing in the parenting world, that there were very few books out there written from non-white perspectives. And so I wrote a book that was very specifically Asian American, Chinese American in particular. And I'm just hoping that people will resonate with it, not only those with an Asian background, but other people of color, and anybody who has grown up with this authoritarian parenting.
Yeah, I notice in a lot of my clients, because in private practice, I work with techies, and there is a generational gap, and a lot of these quote unquote kids are thrown into these managerial roles, these 6-figure salaries, and they haven't had the ability to practice conflict management skills. And so maybe someone on their team is underperforming, or they feel imposter syndrome and not being able to kind of reconcile that with having this quote unquote prestigious job. And then of course they're moving into adult romantic relationships, and maybe wanting to start families. And right, the context is very much in this realm of authoritarian parenting, and kind of trying to also find themselves, because they're in an interesting time as well.
Yes. I feel like this definitely informs the way we do all our relationships. It's not just about parenting, but once we understand needing to just understand boundaries, understand communication and respect, those definitely affect all our other relationships. And I think it affects our relationship with ourselves. I think that's a big part of my own journey, is my relationship with myself. Whereas I, shut down my own emotions. I had very high expectations of myself. I shamed myself and all those things. And learning to change that script in my head, be reparented, so that I can treat myself differently, and in turn treat the people around me differently.
Absolutely. So how can people get in touch with you and become a part of this movement?
Yes. So I have my blog, untigering.com, and also a Facebook page, Untigering, as well as an IG account, and also a Facebook group for those parents who want to dig in a little bit deeper with these concepts. And that's Untigering Parents on Facebook. I'm also on Twitter. I don't post there much, but you can find me there.
Me neither.
Untigering Mom. And if you want to contact me directly, you can email me at untigering@gmail.com.
Amazing. Well, any other last thoughts or words that you wanted to let our audience know?
No, yeah, I'm just really grateful that I had this opportunity to share with your audience. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I mean, this is so important to me. And similarly, this podcast is really about giving a voice and a face to our stories and to talk about the intersection between mental health and entrepreneurship or career building, right? And I think what you're talking about is if we can start with the youth, we won't be at this point where people are just striving and burning out. Thank you so much, Iris. I mean, clearly we're going to be connected for the rest of time to really talk about parenting and so forth. So I appreciate you taking the time and really sharing your perspective and sharing some personal stories.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the Color Success Podcast. Listen, like, subscribe on all major streaming platforms, YouTube, IG, and if you want exclusive content, you can join our Patreon. All links can be found at colorofsuccesspodcast.com.